Good morning, guys, or good afternoon, whenever you're watching this. I just wanted to give you guys a little extra support on this first lesson because there's so many vocabulary terms. So you need to make notes on these vocabulary terms, and the only way to learn new vocabulary is by studying it, okay? So the words that we're going to go over today are, I can't get my mouse to work, I'm so sorry. You're going to need to know all of these terms: complementary angles, supplementary angles, alternate exterior, alternate interior, adjacent angles. You need to know what a transversal is, corresponding angles, and vertical angles. So as we go through, you need to pause the video and write down the definitions of these words, okay, guys? All right, so all of these angles, well, almost all of these angles are created when you have two parallel lines that's crossed by another line. So we all know what parallel lines are, right? Lines that go on and on and on forever and never cross. So hopefully you very quickly picked out the two parallel lines, which is X and Y. So that means line W crosses those two parallel lines. So that makes line W a transversal. So if you have a line that crosses two parallel lines, that is a transversal. And what happens is you create all of these angles that have things in common. All right, so when you have two angles that are across from each other like 1 and 3, those are vertical angles. Vertical angles are across from each other and they're congruent. They're always congruent, okay? So angles 2 and 4 are vertical, angles 5 and 7 are vertical, angles 6 and 8 are vertical. And you have to remember that vertical angles are congruent. You also create all of these supplementary angles. So if I gave you a straight line and I called that a straight angle, hopefully you remember that straight lines equal 180 degrees, okay? So then if I cross, or if I make that straight angle into two angles, hopefully you realize that now we have two angles that when I add them together, I still have to get 180 because together they form the straight line, right? So if this was 110 degrees, that means this little acute angle has to be 70 degrees. So that's supplementary, that together you have two angles that equal 180 degrees. Now, one of the terms that you need to know, but we're not going to use as much in this section, is complementary angles. Complementary angles is when you have two angles that equal 90 degrees, okay? Now, the other two, alternate interior and alternate exterior, like I said, these form when we have two parallel lines that are crossed by a transversal. So you have these 4 angles that are inside the two parallel lines, right? These are inside the two parallel lines. And then you have these other angles, you have 4 that are outside the two parallel lines. So when you have angles that are inside the parallel lines, then those are alternate interior angles. So alternate means on opposite sides of the transversal. So 4 and 6 are alternate interior angles. They're on alternate sides of the transversal. They're inside the parallel lines. And also we have angles 3 and 5 are alternate interior. So 4 and 6 are equal. They're congruent to each other. And angles 3 and 5 are congruent to each other, okay? So notice notice that angles 4 and 6 are little acute angles. Hopefully you remember those vocabulary, little acute angles. So it makes sense that they're equal. And then we have these wide obtuse angles. So 3 and 5 are alternate interior and they're equal to each other. So as far as the other 4 angles, those are outside the parallel line. So we're going to call those alternate exterior angles. They're on opposite sides of the transversal and they are outside the parallel lines. So we have angles 1 and 7 are alternate in exterior angles. See how big they're, wide, obtuse angles. And then we have angles 2 and 8. They're alternate exterior angles and they are congruent. Okay. All right. Now let's talk real quick about corresponding angles. Corresponding angles are, they are angles that are in the same place on the parallel lines. Okay, so for example, let's look at angle 7. Angle 7 is to the right of the transversal and below the parallel line, right? So it corresponds to angle 3. Angle 7 and 3 are in the same place on each of the parallel lines, okay? Now, the other thing you need to know about corresponding angles is they are congruent. So 3 and 7 are corresponding angles and they are equal to each other. What about angle 1? Angle 1 corresponds to angle 5. They're in the same position on each parallel line. What does angle 2 correspond with? Angle 2 corresponds with angle 6. And 4, this little acute angle corresponds with angle 8 because they are in the same position on the parallel lines. The only word we haven't talked about is adjacent. So I'll get to that in just a second. So just to review, supplementary angles, when you add those two numbers together, you get 180 degrees. They always form this straight line together. They form a straight line. Straight lines are always 180 degrees. Complementary is when you have two angles that add to be 90. Together they make a right angle. See, remember that little box represents a 90-degree angle? All right, so if I asked you what the missing values were, number 1, hopefully you recognize that's a supplementary angle. Well, there are two supplementary angles. So if we subtract 130 from 180, we would see that angle X is what? 50 degrees, right? So 50 degrees. All right, these are supplementary angles, right? They make this big straight line. So if we subtract 77 degrees from 180, we would get 103. Angle Y is 103 degrees. So numbers 3 and 4, hopefully you recognize that these are complementary angles. So if I wrote an equation, it would look like this. And then to solve for X, I would subtract 62 from both sides. And I would get, what, 28 degrees. Angle X is 28 degrees. And angle X down here is 15 degrees. All right, hope that makes sense. Now let's talk about adjacent angles. Adjacent angles are angles that share a common vertex and a common side. In other words, they're next door neighbors. So do you see that 2 and 3 are right beside each other? They're next door neighbors. They share a common side. They share the same vertical right here, or vertex, I should say, sorry, vertex. So angles 2 and 3 together make this nice straight line right there, right? So these adjacent angles happen to be supplementary because I can tell that angle 2 plus angle 3 is 180 degrees because they form a nice straight line together. Okay, so adjacent angles are next door neighbors, all right? So these are all, the rest of these are reviewed because I've already told you what they are. Vertical angles are, they're opposite angles. They're straight across from each other and they're always congruent. So angles 1 and 3 are vertical. Angles 2 and 4 are vertical. Corresponding angles is when you have two parallel lines cut by a transversal. They are in the same place on each parallel line and they are congruent. All right, look at these two. Actually, there's 3 lines, right? What are the parallel lines? The parallel lines are N and P, and line M is called what? the transversal. So think in your head, give me a pair of vertical angles. So what is your answer? Hopefully you know that 1 and 3 are vertical, 2 and 4 are vertical angles, 5 and 7 are vertical, and 6 and 8 are vertical. And what's true about vertical lines? They are congruent. All right, what about supplementary angles? Remember, 2 angles together that equal 180 are supplementary. So 1 and 4 are supplementary, 5 and 6, 2 and 3, 8 and 7 are supplementary, but also 1 and 2, find those, 3 and 4 are supplementary, 5 and 8, and 6 and 7 are supplementary angles. Adjacent angles, actually every pair I just named are also adjacent. They share a common side, so 1 and 2 are adjacent, 1 and 4 are adjacent, 4 and 3 are adjacent, so on and so forth. All the supplementary angles in this situation are adjacent. Now that doesn't mean that every pair of adjacent angles are supplementary. Sometimes they're complementary and sometimes they're neither. But if they're next door neighbors, they are adjacent. Of course, our 2 parallel lines, we've already said, are N and P, and the transversal is letter M. And now let's look at corresponding angles. Corresponding angles are in the same position on each parallel line. So 1 and 5 are corresponding, and they're equal to each other. 4 and 6 are corresponding angles, 2 and 8, and 3 and 7. Now, I didn't ask about alternate interior and alternate exterior. I should have. Alternate interior. Now, remember, what does interior mean? It means inside the parallel lines and opposite the transversal. So inside the parallel lines, so we're talking about this space in here, right? So opposite the transversal, so 3 and 5 are alternate interior, and they're congruent, and 4 and 8 are alternate interior, okay? And they are equal to each other. What about alternate exterior angles? So alternate means opposite of the transversals and outside the parallel lines. So I have 6 and 2 are alternate exterior angles, and the other 2 are 1 and 7. All right, let's try this. So let's think about these words up here: adjacent, supplementary, vertical, corresponding. If I told you that angle 6 is 100 degrees, hopefully you can figure out the measurement of every single angle on this picture. So since 6 and 8 are vertical angles, that means that angle 8 is also 100 degrees. Hold on, my pen, my picky pen. All right, 100 degrees for angle 8. What else do we know? We know that 6 and 5 are adjacent angles. They are also supplementary. Supplementary angles equal 180 degrees. So if angle 6 is 100, angle 5 is 80. All right, what about 4 and 6? What are their relationships? They are corresponding angles. Corresponding angles are equal. So that means angle 4 is 100 degrees. Angle 8 and 2 are corresponding. Angles 5 and 1 are corresponding. They are equal to each other. Angle 1 and 3 are vertical. They're equal to each other. And so is 5 and 7. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys, that you could figure out all those angles if you only have one. All right, now these are both examples of vertical angles. They're across from each other, they're equal. So if this big obtuse angle is 120, that means X is also 120. These two angles, these two pairs of angles form this straight line on both sides of the line I'm drawing. So that means Angle X and angle Y are supplementary, right? So if X is 120, that means Y must be 80 degrees. No, it's not, just kidding, 60 degrees. If angle Y, oh, they're the same letters, so hopefully that tells you they're the same measurements. So now we have 180 degrees. Either any way you look at these pairs of angles, you have 180 degrees, a sum of 180 degrees. All right, what about down here? We have vertical angles, which means they're equal. So we're going to literally write that m plus 30 is equal to 80. We're trying to find the measure of m. Well, if I subtract 30 from both sides of the equal sign, it tells me that letter M has a value of 50. 50 degrees plus 30 degrees is 80 degrees. And then we have these two supplementary angles, right? Which means that if this equals 180, sorry, if this equals 80, letter B must be 100 degrees. Hope you guys are understanding. All right, so once again, alternate interior angles means that they are on opposite sides of the transversal, but inside the parallel lines. And what else is true about alternate interior angles? They are always congruent. Alternate exterior angles are also always congruent, and they are on opposite sides of the transversal and outside the parallel lines. So let's look at these two examples. So we find, first of all, you identify your two parallel lines. So our two parallel lines are M and N. Our transversal is letter T, and then we can find all the other relationships. So angle 150, big obtuse angle, right? It's vertical to this big obtuse angle. So vertical angles are congruent. What is the corresponding angle to this big obtuse angle? It's in the same position on the other parallel line, so that means it's right here. 150 is vertical from this angle. And then how do we get the other four angles? Well, hopefully we can, several different ways, right? We have pairs of supplementary angles. Here's two on both sides of my line I just drew. So if this is 150, that means the supplement to that would be 30 degrees. And then you think, okay, well, I have vertical angles, so that's 30. And then we have corresponding angles, 30 and 30. Okay, so let's look at this picture down here. So let's call these letters, let's see, J and K. Those are our parallel lines. Now a transversal goes across two parallel lines. So we'll call this transversal letter W. So then, even though we have an extra line right here, all of the things we've already talked about as far as transversals and corresponding angles and alternate interior angles, so on and so forth, are true. So let's look at this angle. So if I asked you, what is the alternate interior angle to 78 degrees? Hopefully you recognize it's both of these put together. So it starts here, right? And it stops here, because you have to be on the opposite sides of this transversal. So we're only looking at this transversal right here. So I understand there's an extra line, but alternate interior angles are equal. So that means that 20 degrees plus X has to equal 78 degrees, because they're alternate interior angles. Y'all understand what I'm saying? Hopefully you do. These two, oh my goodness, I'm not a good drawer. Is that a word? A drawer? All right, so if I want to solve for X, I'm going to subtract 20 from both sides. And I know that angle X is got to be 58 degrees. So 58 degrees for just angle X. And then if I add that 20 right here, that would give me that 78 total, okay? And with that information, I can figure out every single other angle that's, given to me, but the directions on this situation would probably be to solve for X. All right, I hope that helps you guys. So I hope everybody has a good week. I will see you for our Zoom tomorrow. So have a great day.